Well, for everybody who's on, just want to say thanks for joining us. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a housekeeping for the webinar, we are going to record this. We're going to push it to the Training Peaks YouTube channel within about 24 hours. We will send out a follow-up email to anyone who registered, and it'll have links to the video and all the information that Dan and Paul are going to share. And then during the webinar, feel free to jump into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to put some questions in there, or if you need some clarity on something that they're sharing, we will get to those towards the end in the Q&A. And then yeah, so first let's introduce these good guys. We've got Dan Plews, the founder of Enduro IQ. And then he's a applied sports scientist, researcher, and coach. In addition to being a world-class Ironman athlete, he's worked with a bunch of athletes in the world level. And then he's got a PhD in applied heart rate variability with over 70 reviewed uh, publications in applied sports science and exercise physiology. And then Paul, he's an elite swim coach, author, and founder of Swim Smooth and Swim Smooth Guru. Um, these are some swim coaching systems that he's going to cover here in this presentation. And he's got a sport and exercise science background from University of Bath, and he's an open water swimmer and likes to compete in the Rottnest Channel swim. I'm going to step out of the way, let you guys get to it.
Great stuff. Thanks, Josh, for the introduction. It's very kind of you there. It's great to be on the Training Peaks webinar today. Thanks ever so much for everyone signing in. I've been a big fan of Training Peaks for a long period of time now. In fact, I think I was one of the earliest adopters way back in the early 2000s. In fact, this book, the Training and Racing with Power by Hunter Allen and Andy Coggan, is quite fundamental for some of the stuff that we're actually going to be talking about today. In 2007, I flew down to Colorado Springs to be part of the Triathlon Congress, talking about technology in triathlon with Training Peaks. It was a fantastic course. And during that time, obviously, there was a lot of talk about training with power meters on the bike and Garmin's on the run, but very little regard for swimming. And that's simply because the technology at that point didn't really exist. We're going to talk today about how we can add some really good data-driven insights and actionable advice to help you improve your swimming. Now, just on this title here, you're not a swimmer, you're a triathlete. If you're tuning in and you happen to be purely a swimmer, an open water swimmer, it's not meant to be a dig at you guys at all. The whole idea here is that whether you're a distance freestyler for open water swimming or indeed you are doing triathlon, some of what we're going to cover today will really help to resonate and just set you on the right path to making sure you've got the right technique and you're doing the right type of training to help you improve your swimming. It's really great to be on the call today with Dr. Dan Plews. Believe it or not, me and Dan have actually been racing against each other for over 30 years in triathlon. This was a couple of years ago over in New Zealand. Dan invited me over for a training camp. You can see he's got his finger up in the air, one position. So we did an open water race, and I could see Dan killing himself laughing in the background there. We came up sprinting across the finishing line at the end, and he just picked me across the line. But I would like to point out that Dan was wearing a wetsuit. He was drafting on my feet the entire way, and you can see with my scarring there, I've actually got broken ribs. But we'll let that one pass, Dan. Right? Just joking. But
Excuses.
excuses.
A
Those are my
win's a
excuses.
win.
So we've been very good friends for a long period of time, and it's great to be on the webinar with Dan, sharing our advice to help you improve your swimming. So on that train of thought, some of you may remember the original Swim Smooth DVD, which came out in 2004. It had 3 discs in that box set. Disc number 1 was all about improving your technique for triathlon and open water swimming. Disc number 2 was showing you the type of training sessions, and you had a training plan within there to make sure you're doing the right type of training, which fundamentally can be very different, as we'll discuss today, to like masters training sessions, which tend to be short, sharp intervals with lots of rest and recovery. And then we also showed you how to adapt your stroke to the open water as well. Now, I'm going to be covering today primarily the technique side. Dan will be covering the training side, but of course, we will be talking a lot about the implications on this for open water swimming. So my belief is that as a triathlete or open water swimmer, there are really two things, two key issues, if you like, facing you in terms of actually improving your swimming. And the first would be non-specific advice. Now, YouTube and the internet is full of information on how to actually improve your swimming. There are many companies out there who primarily have come from a pure swimming background and obviously try to jump on the triathlon bandwagon, if you like, and offering training solutions to help you improve. But fundamentally, Swim Smooth wasn't created by swimmers jumping on the triathlon bandwagon. We are triathletes who've created a swim program and fundamentally understand what it is like to swim in a triathlon or open water to help you improve and get better. And that really was the onus of Swim Smooth way back in 2004 when I created it, was just to show you how maybe a triathlon stroke or open water stroke could be different. So we're going to try and get very, very specific with that advice today. And we've got some great examples of that. My other belief, and I've just touched on it briefly there back in 2007 when I was down there at the Congress with Training Peaks, was this lack of data-driven training specifically for swimming. Now, that has improved a lot and very rapidly in the last 2 or 3 years. And we're going to discuss today about how you can really get quite actionable with that advice there. Okay, now who better to kick off this video presentation, especially about triathlon swimming technique, than the world's best ever swimmer in triathlon, in my opinion, Lucy Charles-Barclay, who obviously won the 2023 Hawaii Ironman World Championships. In this, I love this image here. Look at that really great high elbow catch and pull through that she's got here. In the picture as well is her husband, Reese. I've done quite a bit of video analysis and coaching with both of these two guys, both in Mallorca in Spain and over in the UK as well. So we're just going to start off the presentation by listening to a snippet. It's about 50 seconds long, listening to what Lucy thinks about her own swimming. So here we go.
My stroke, probably from looking at it from the outside, people would probably say it's a fairly messy stroke. Like I've got a very high turnover, and then I haven't got much of a leg kick either. So most coaches I ever had would always tell me off for not kicking my legs, which I always found quite funny. And no matter what I did, I tried to work on it, but I kind of, because I guess the front end of my stroke was moving so fast, I just didn't have the coordination to do that with my legs as well. So I think it seems to work pretty well for open water, or it's definitely served me well so far. I think the key thing is it might look a little bit messy from above the water, but everything under the water is doing what you're supposed to do and is quite a strong, powerful pull under the water. So I think when I was more of a pool swimmer, it was probably a bit of a neater stroke, and I've adapted it without really realising it for the open water.
Well, that's got to be the understatement of the year that it's worked well for her in open water and triathlon. Obviously, I just saw some stats earlier on before I jumped on the webinar. Lucy Charles last year in the T100 series, her average speed for the last for a top three events there at the T100 in the open water was 116 per 100 meters. In the men's, coached by Dan, Aaron Royal at 111 per 100 meters. So it's really quite interesting that you don't necessarily need to look pretty to be effective, and that really is the onus on what we're going to go through here today. Now, this is also quite an interesting quote as well. Alistair and Jonathan Brownlee wrote a book, I think it was in late 2012 after the London Olympic Games. It's a fantastic book called Swim, Bike and Run. I'm just going to read out a paragraph from this right now. We use this paragraph quite frequently in our webinars talking about triathlon swimming. And again, coming directly from the horse's mouth, somebody who's obviously double Olympic gold medalist, he certainly knows a thing or two about what it takes to swim really well in a triathlon. So Alistair says, swimming for triathlon is very different from swimming in a pool. You don't want the perfect stroke because you're not swimming alone in a pristine pool lane. You're being bashed around, beaten up, thumped by waves. A lot of triathlon coaching tells you that the fewer strokes you take, the better. Not for us. I swim the best when I'm fit. It's as simple as that. I don't swim off a powerful stroke or a long stroke, but on arm turnover, the number of strokes I can take per minute. I also think that swimming properly for triathlon is something that not many people in the world genuinely understand. And who can argue with him with the accolades that he has? In fact, I shared a beer with Alistair and Johnny over in Bradford in the UK, which is very close to where me and Dan are both from. And I simply asked Alistair, "What do you reckon to your stroke technique?" And he just simply responded, "It's shit." Now, excuse the profanity there, but that's exactly what he said. And he was saying that simply because a lot of people would look at his stroke and say, "Oh, it doesn't look technically perfect like a pool swimmer's stroke," but it certainly worked very, very well for him, obviously. Now, just coming on to Dan's going to cover a lot more about this on the training side of things, but I thought this was quite useful to actually kick it off. I mentioned earlier on that I was heavily influenced by this fantastic book and all the great stuff that the Training Peaks guys do. Back in, God, it would have been about 2006 when I started reading that book before the Congress. I started to search ideas on, well, okay, FTP, functional threshold power on the bike is a very, very useful metric to monitor and measure your training. Nothing like that was readily used in swimming. Now, a thing called critical swim speed. I'm often quoted as the guy who created this. I just want to put my hands up and say I didn't. I just popularized it, I guess, with the advent of the Swim Smooth Guru, which we're going to dig into. Critical swim speed has actually been published and been in the papers since 1991. And the idea was to use two tests, a 400-meter, and back then it was a 50-meter time trial, to work out and extrapolate what speed you'd be able to swim at over 1,500 meters. So to determine your threshold pace. So not too dissimilar to doing the FTP test on the bike, where you could do a 60-minute test, but the recommendation is to do 20 and then multiply it by 95% or whatever it is, basically. But what's really interesting about this, on this little chart right in front of us, in orange is Lucy Charles Barkley. In blue is Reese Barkley, her husband and her coach. Now, he is a fantastic swimmer. Like I say, done some coaching with him, done some swimming with him as well. And he is a beast over the shorter distances, especially. In fact, his 200 and 400 times are quite a bit quicker than Lucy. But what you can see with the chart here is the rate of drop off. Reese drops down quite quickly, so that over 1,500 meters. Lucy's PB, 16:45, if you can believe it, at the 2021 Olympic trials for Tokyo, is really quite swift. And obviously, we all know what the damage she can do in the open water over 3.8K. In fact, Reese has never actually beaten her over that distance, but in the pool would be miles ahead. Now, what's interesting about this is if we overlay Katie Ledecky's performance profile or physiological profile, you'll see it's very, very similar to Lucy's. Of course, Katie Ledecky is faster than Lucy, but look at the similarity in the rate of drop off. So both of these two athletes are what I'd describe as diesel engines. Reese, even though he does now Ironman training and has done very, very well with that, would be definitely more of what we call a petrol engine. So he's got the ability to go fast, but maybe hasn't got the sustainability to sustain that speed over longer distances. That said, I'd still be very, very happy with some of the speeds that he can swim over the Ironman distance. Now, we're just going to have a little look at this image here. And as we start to dig into data-driven insights to help you swimming, if you have a Garmin device or an Apple Watch, using the device you already own, we can now detect what your stroke looks like. And if we just play that image again, this here is Penny Slater, who I was doing some work with a couple of months ago. She finished 7th at the Nice Ironman World Championships just back in 2024 there. And you can see here that Penny is pulling very, very wide. What the accelerometers and gyros within your Apple Watch or indeed your Garmin device, we released this on Garmin back in late December, so it's very, very new to the system. If you're wearing that watch, those accelerometers and gyros, we can then visually represent using our algorithm, we call it Stroke Insights, to show you exactly what your stroke is doing. Now, the cool thing about this is if we just advance that on, obviously, you can do this using the device that you already own, so you don't need to rush out and buy any fancy additional equipment, anything, any of the Garmin's. I think we cover over 100 different Garmin devices. They will work with this system. But we can also detect other aspects of the stroke as well. In fact, 6 key aspects of your technique. And all you need to do is just literally swim with the watch on your wrist. Now, we can see here on both sides that right now, we're actually looking at the swimmer's pull through. Now, this gentleman, you can see he's actually reaching quite deep and straight with the left arm, whereas the right hand, he's actually pulling a little bit too close to his body. The little underlay, the green underlay there, shows him where he should be pulling through. And on a subsequent session, he can work to actually get to that point. We score this on a score of out of 5 basically. So his left hand side is reaching deep, 2.3 out of 5. His right hand side, because it's got a bigger impact of actually pulling too close to the body, only 0.9 out of 5 there. Now, if we look at the same swimmer, and I just want to point out here that you can see, I mentioned he's a male swimmer, but we've got a female avatar here if we just wanted to mix up the use of the avatars. But this is the same swimmer. And what we can see on the right-hand side is this right arm recovery comes up into what we call the swinger target zone. Lucy Charles Barkley talked about how she had a very messy stroke, but it's ideal for open water swimming. Having this higher arm recovery over the top of the water, even though it doesn't look like the more classic smooth style on as he's got on the left-hand side, it can be very effective. The reason he's got such a disparity, though, is because without even seeing him swim, I can deduce that this swimmer only breathes to the right-hand side. And that's backed up by the first insight, showing that he's actually using his left hand to prop and push down on the water, getting that rotation and bringing the arm up and over on this side. He'll be much flatter in the water on his left-hand side. Now, we can also detect whether or not, and you heard that from the horse's mouth with Alistair Brownlee saying he doesn't swim off a long stroke or try to reduce the number of strokes he's taking. He actually does the opposite. He tries to keep the stroke rate up. And many of the world's best open water swimmers and triathletes tend to swim with very, very high stroke rates, which is contrary to the convention of the typical advice you might find on YouTube or Google or just the worldview of freestyle swimming, if you like. So we're able to detect the timing of your stroke as well. Now, this particular swimmer, they are basically significantly overgliding. So what we mean by this is they're actually pausing and stopping between strokes and decelerating. That is something you don't want to do. Even in the pool, water is 800 times more dense than air. If you're pausing and stopping at the front of the pool, just because you've heard that if you can go down the pool with fewer strokes, that's not going to make you more efficient. So we're talking about the swimmer having significant overgliding, and the implication of this is around about 11.5 seconds given the severity per 100 meters. Now that sounds like a lot, but you've only got to try and swim in the open water with a catch-up style against rough chop to realize just how inefficient and ineffective that is. And, you know, if it was effective, you would see all of the triathlon ITU swimmers swimming like that, but they don't. They have that higher tempo. Now, interest to some of you here might be how to actually save your shoulders, especially if you train up for an Ironman and maybe you've lifted up your volume of your training. One of our insights looks at how the hand goes into the water. Now, you can try this whilst you're actually sat there, popping your arms out in front of you like so. My hands are right now in a neutral position with the palm of the hand looking down at the desk. If I turn my thumb down, it internally rotates the shoulder and puts a lot of stress on the top of the shoulder there. So this younger swimmer, she's wearing an Apple Watch. You can see that she's going into the water and she's got a severe thumb first entry. Now, this can affect the health of the shoulder on the long term. We don't want to get injured in the shoulders. So if you have had an injury in the past, well worth checking this out and giving it a bit of a test. But equally, it then also compromises the way you catch and pull through as well. So something we want to avoid. Now, this next one, that we're on to number 5 of 6 insights. This insight shows you your recovery and rotation. So what your arm actually looks like almost from like a bird's eye view with respect to whether or not you're rotating down the long axis of the spine there. On my left-hand side, this is my image. This is my data, if you like. You can see that my left arm, it's almost like my hand leads the elbow on the recovery, and I've got less rotation on the left than on the right. If you think back to our first swimmer, who I mentioned about the type of breathing that he does, in my earlier junior days, I breathed primarily to the right-hand side. Now, I like to practice what I preach these days, and I do breathe bilaterally. In fact, I'm actually faster breathing to my left than to my right. And given the fact that most triathlon events are on left-hand turn courses, breathing to the left is a lot better. So I am trying to improve this. On this particular data point, I got 1.3 out of 5. Earlier on this week, you'll be pleased to know I got to 2.8 out of 5. It's still not great, but it's better than it was. And that's really the whole point of using these to track your insights and track your technique development over time. Okay, last insight before we move on is the hand entry going into the water, the entry position. A lot of people tend to cross over in front of their head. What we can also deduce from the guy who's breathing to the right is he's probably doing that more with his left hand than he's doing with the right hand. The left-hand entry into the water here, especially when you go to take a breath in, if it's crossing over, firstly, it's going to make you zigzag in the open water. But secondly, one of the other implications, and we can't measure this with the watch, but we just from experience, we know that that will cause the legs to scissor kick apart, create drag, and slow you down. Now, this is an error on this screen. The reason the right hand is not showing is because I only swam with the watch on the left-hand side during that session. A lot of people say, how can you get insights on both sides when you've only got one watch? A lot of people have asked us, do we need to go out and buy two Apple Watches or two Garmin? No, you don't need to do that. You just swim with the watch on one wrist and then switch it over halfway through the session, usually after around about 500 meters or something like that, and it'll pick up the data without you having to do anything. Don't need to press any buttons, just switch it over onto the other wrist. So you see, the thing is, we've just created this integration with Garmin. Garmin have been collecting a lot of data about swimming for many, many years, and for you guys doing triathlon, getting that swimming feedback on things like your pacing and your stroke rate and that type of thing. But the problem is, the more data we collect, we need to obviously be able to interpret that data. And that's one of the real drawbacks at the moment, still to this day with swimming, is that this data is not being interpreted, and it's certainly not being able to give you actionable advice on how to improve. And one of the things that we've really tried to do here with the Swim Smooth Guru is to make sure that not only are we actually giving you the data and giving you a representation on 1 to 5 of what it's like, but we'll then show you videos on how to actually improve that and give you training sessions on how to improve as well. So it really is the full circle there, if you like. Again, Dan's going to dig more into this a little bit later on, but the type of training that you can do, you can plug into the Swim Smooth Guru exactly what event you're training up for, whether it be a sprint distance triathlon, whether it be like we've got on the screen here, a 20-kilometer open water event that's happening here in Perth, as Josh said earlier on, the Rottnest Channel Swim. We can actually show you exactly what type of training sessions you need to be doing, and then you can plot them and log them as you're going along. Now, this is just swimming, of course, and this is where the integration with EndureIQ and TrainingPeaks really comes in. We've got over, I think Dan advertised it as 1,000 training sessions. We've actually got over, just calculated yesterday, 6,500 training sessions within the Swim Smooth Guru, which can now be ported across via EndureIQ into TrainingPeaks or via our certified Swim Smooth coaches into TrainingPeaks, so you can actually follow these training sessions along. And one of the big bonuses, indirect result of that, is that the sessions can actually be then transferred over onto your watch. Now, that's still fairly in its infancy at this point in time, but it does work, and you can send it across to your watch and follow the training sessions, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and print out the sessions. We'll just bring that up. Just there we go. Look, you can print out the training sessions with full detail about what you need to do with respect to your swimming. Now, I'll just whiz back there. Sorry about that. So on this Rottnest Channel Swim program, you can see that the swimmer has these sessions to do. All of these sessions are geared specifically to you. So if you've done your homework and you've done your critical swim speed, you'll just simply enter it in there. And then every training session that you do will be able to tell you exactly what pace to swim at, appropriate for your goals of the particular event. Now, many of you will be interested and familiar with training balance and training stress score. I mentioned in 2007, I came to the Congress with TrainingPeaks and I actually presented to them at that point my theory or my formula, if you like, for swimming training stress score. Now, we're still using that to this day, nearly 20 years later, the same formula. TrainingPeaks uses a slightly different formula. So if you look at some of the numbers, you'll actually see that we score you slightly lower on the STSS score. But if you're actually bringing the data across into TrainingPeaks anyway, TrainingPeaks will run their algorithm through it and give you a score which you're more familiar with. But this has been fundamentally important for our swimming community because swimmers, you guys doing triathlon, you've had all this data on your bike and run for a long, long period of time. But for swimming, this just hasn't been there. So next week for this Rottnest Channel Swim, I'm able to show swimmers exactly how to taper down for that event using the fitness, fatigue, and form lines to make sure they're really well prepared for it. So every session you do, like the Goldilocks session here, Dan's going to talk a little bit about that later on. You can plug it straight into TrainingPeaks. If you're an EndureIQ coach, they can push that across to you. If you're a Swim Smooth coach, we can push that across to you there. We've just got that little export tab. If you're just a general user, you won't have that facility to do that just yet, but it's an exclusive perk for the EndureIQ coaching team and the Swim Smooth coaches at this stage. Nonetheless, if we have a little look here, one of the things that we utilize to actually help you improve your pacing and get you really dialed in. Again, this is my data here. So my current threshold pace is around about just under 118 per 100. So I think it's 117.81. Now you can say, do you really need to get that accurate? Well, the answer is yes. This is accurate to 1/100th of a second. Each week, as I progress, I just go in there and tweak my CSS and make it a little bit faster than the week before to ensure that I'm actually continuously improving. And that really is very much a game changer for me and for my swimmers that I coach. If you're really interested in how to utilize things like the tempo trainer, your smart devices, goggles, watches, etc., last week we published a blog called Swimming by Numbers. To read that, just go to blog.swimsmooth.com. It's probably the longest blog I've ever written. And if you've ever followed any of my blogs, you'll know they're actually pretty long. So this one is very, very comprehensive and detailed. Some great videos to watch to really understand how to follow our methodology, if you like, for improving your swimming for triathlon. Okay, now we mentioned this critical swim speed. You can go into the Guru and actually just punch in your numbers. I've actually taken Lucy Charles Barkley's data here. So let's have a little look at how it pans out for her. Now, as I mentioned beforehand, she is what I'd describe as a diesel engine. The way we can look at that is by looking at the rate of drop off between your 200 and your 400 speed. For her, it's 3.9%. If we had Reese's data in here, it'd be well over 5%, probably even as close as to 7%. And we describe him as a petrol engine. That then dictates the type of training that you want to be doing for the event that you want to get better at. And for anything over 1,500 meters, so Olympic distance and above, you really want to be trying to develop that diesel engine. And the type of training that Dan's going to go through with you is really critical for that. A lot of people think, I just want to get faster with my swimming. They'll go to a master's club and they'll do 2100s or even 10 100s, but with a massive rest. And they think they're hitting really fast times. But the problem is those long rest periods are just not practical and not sustainable for longer distance open water swimming for triathlon. So it's really important that you know what training sessions to do. We can also see here that Lucy has elite level pacing, as you'd expect. But what's cool about this is it'll actually predict your race performances as well. And for Lucy, it's got it to literally within a second. In fact, it's bang on. So her 1,500 meter PB is 16:45, set at the Tokyo trials in 2021. That's really fast. And given that, we've all seen her swimming, 46, 47, 48 minutes in the Ironman. If she was to swim a fresh Ironman distance swim, 3.8 kilometers, without having to worry about getting out on the bike and run, the performance predictor would suggest that she'd be capable of doing about just over 45 minutes, which is crazy quick. But then again, you've all seen her give clean heels to everybody else in the field there. And the nice thing about this as well, we can also give you like a 10-week training program utilizing the tempo trainer, showing you, like I mentioned it there, just showing you how to increase your pace a little bit each week. For Lucy, over 10 weeks, we might be able to get about 30 seconds improvement over 1,500, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're swimming at her speed, that's a huge amount of improvement. For most people, swimming more like the 2 minutes per 100 for your threshold pace, we might be able to see in that period of time around about 2 minutes 15 per 100 meters improvement. But it's all about following, obviously, a structured plan to get to that point. So just to summarize here, I've got a few more slides just to go before I pass over to Dan. One of the key things facing you is this non-specific advice. There's a lot of focus on the internet on gliding more, long strokes, higher elbow recovery, but that's just not race specific for you guys. And your approach to this really needs to be quite different. We talk a lot at Swim Smooth and in all the articles that we write over the years about stroke rate and the importance of getting that stroke rate up. Obviously how you sight and even how you pace for the bike and run as well. And I've got a great little video clip with Chelsea Sodaro just coming up on that ticket. And then second point there is lack of data-driven training. Obviously, swimming has in the past been very much feel-based, but it doesn't have to be. This is me trying to do my best example of DC Rainmaker, testing 4 watches last week, 3 Garmin's and 1 Apple Watch, all on the same wrist. It was quite an interesting experiment there. But swimming doesn't have to be feel-based anymore. If you're new to swimming, you probably don't have that feel. If we can give you those data-driven insights, then you can really help to improve your swimming there. So today's goal is to swim smarter, not just more, and to use triathlon-specific technique and data training for improving your efficiency. So great little shot here of Dan coming out of the water. That's where he picked me in New Zealand. Well done, Dan. Um, so with this here, we all know that swimming in the open water is quite different to swimming in the pool. Obviously, things such as the rough chop, but even just swimming in close quarters with people and wearing the wetsuit as well. I mentioned about that higher swinger arm recovery style. If you've got a wetsuit on, the restriction of the neoprene around your shoulders, if you're trying to follow conventional swimming technique advice to get the elbow really high like this, you're going to be working against that neoprene and fatiguing your shoulders very quickly. So if you're one of those people who thinks to themselves, I'm going to get a short sleeve wetsuit because it hurts my shoulders and I get really fatigued, chances are it's not the wetsuit, it could be your technique. So try opening out that angle at the elbow, bringing the arm more up and over in that sort of swinger style, and you might just find some really good relief from that. Now, we haven't got time to dig into this properly, but I'm going to give you some resources here. Last year, we published our freestyle stroke correction hierarchy. This is something which we've had published on the website since 2004, but I put together 5 new YouTube video clips last year talking about how to improve your breathing. So that'd be the first thing you'd want to consider, how to reduce your drag, how to increase your posture and alignment so you're not crossing over in front of the head, how to improve your catch and pull through. That's the one that everyone really wants to get into, but unless you've done steps 1, 2, and 3 correctly, you're missing a bit of a beat there. And then finally, rhythm and timing as well, showing you how to optimize your stroke rate for and kick timing. So if you are a bit of an overglider, I would strongly suggest you watch video 5 down at the bottom there, stop gliding, counting strokes for smooth and effortless swimming. And we've had some fantastic feedback on that particular video clip, people watching it and literally overnight dropping massive amounts of time off their swimming because we're fundamentally changing the way that they swim for the better. So we've just got these 2 video clips to do, and then I'll pass you over to Dan. This one here is a great little video clip. This is Richard Varga, arguably one of the fastest male swimmers in triathlon. He's swimming on the video clip on the right-hand side, and on the left is one of my favorite swimmers of all time, double Olympic gold medalist Rebecca Adlington. Look at how different their stroke style is over the top of the water. Despite the fact that Richard comes from a pool swimming background, he's still got that very high arm recovery. Let's listen to it now.
Richard Varga from Slovakia is forcing the pace at the front of the field here.
Now, again, if he was using the stroke insights there, you could see that the left arm recovery comes up and over a lot higher. He's rotating more to his left. So he would have a similar profile to the gentleman that I was just showing you, but just the opposite way around. Now, let's just watch this one here about Chelsea Sodaro. So back in 2022, I did some coaching, some video analysis with Chelsea. We identified what she needed to improve her swimming, primarily because of how it was impacting negatively on her bike and run performance. Let's listen to this.
I've been in Mallorca before Hamburg. Dan's really good friend, Paul Newsome, happened to be there. And Paul took the time to do a session in the pool with me, and we realized that I had been kicking way too much during the swim. And so when I would start the bike leg in my previous races that season, I was totally gassed, like I had no power. And so we sorted that out a bit. And when I got to Hamburg, I finally felt good when I got on the bike. I was seeing these splits and just, when you're seeing positive feedback on your bike computer and on the course, it just makes you more and more motivated.
In this pool a couple of years ago, I was working with Lucy Charles. She can kick like this, but she kicks like this when she's racing. Yeah. She's got a stroke which could look a lot longer and smoother like yours does over here, but she doesn't swim like that. She swims like this because it's the optimal way for her to swim. But with that instruction to slow the stroke rate down a little bit, you by and large lengthen out the stroke and build some of this leg kick in. And I think that might tally up with why you're feeling maybe in the first 5 or 6 Ks on the bike. Yeah. While maybe just sort of a bit cooked at that point.
It really is incredible. And you did mention Paul Newsome. Big shout out to Paul. He does get swimming, especially when it's specific to triathlon and open water. Looking through your performances and your results before the show, it was incredible to see your swim times suddenly accelerate from Mallorca onwards.
Now, excuse me. Now, I don't know Simon Whitfield, but I'm a huge fan. Obviously, the Sydney Olympics 2000 Olympic champion. And in 2013, I saw a funny tweet from him, which was really highlights all of that. And the tweet basically said, if you are, it was a shout out to triathlon coaches around the world. He says, if you're teaching your swimmers to lengthen out their stroke and kick like crazy, unless you're doing a game of the opposite, this is bad advice. And, again, Olympic gold medalist Simon Whitfield there, recognizing that what Chelsea had been doing prior to the video analysis session just didn't suit her. And it was really, really hampering her on the bike and run. So this hookup then between Swim Smooth and the Endure Ice Q squad, Daniel will detail this a little bit more in just a moment's time. But by being one of the Endure IQ athletes or being one of the Swim Smooth coached by one of the Swim Smooth coaches, you can have that access to the Swim Smooth Guru, and we can send those sessions over to TrainingPeaks and equally come back into the Guru to analyze your swimming. If you want to just check out the Guru by yourself, you can just do this 7-day free trial. Just go to swimsmooth.guru. So then finally, this is the question which everybody is always asking here. Will technique or AI really ever replace real coaches? And I want to be really clear about this. Emphatically, no. One of the great things I believe about TrainingPeaks is how it actually brings coaches from right around the world to connect them with real swimmers, real triathletes, and these are real coaches working with real people. Same with Endure IQ, same with our team of Swim Smooth coaches right around the world. We're going to be in Mallorca at the end of May, start of June, training up our next batch, our class of 2025. If any of you are interested, just jump on the swimsmooth.com website and find out a little bit more about how to become a Swim Smooth coach. We can teach you how to learn the skills of the video analysis online, and then invite you over to Mallorca to be with us there. So working with athletes like this, it's really, I've been doing this now for over 25 years, and it's still the thing that gets me up at 4:38 every single morning to be on the pool deck with them over here in Perth. And this is just a little quote here from one of our coaches, or rather a review of one of our coaches here. This lady here, she says, I've tried to correct my technique by using YouTube videos, but I just made things worse. And she talks about how the one session with Sally, our coach here in Perth, the video analysis really helped to cement the difference. And that's the problem, YouTube is so ubiquitous, and don't get me wrong, there's some great content out there, etc. But you don't really know if it applies to you. What we try to do with the Swim Smooth Guru is actually put our advice and then actually funnel it to you directly based on those actionable insights that we get from the data-driven recordings that we're actually making. So if you happen to be looking for a coach, a Swim Smooth coach, just jump onto the swimsmooth.guru/coaches, and you can see all of our coaches dotted around the world. Hopefully it'll be someone close to you, and maybe even a squad like this one to help you improve your swimming. I'll pass you over to Dan just now. Thanks, Dan.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Paul. I think everyone will agree that there was some great insights and some exciting things going on in that regard. You have to stop sharing your screen, Paul, so I can swap
Beg
over.
your pardon.
Thank you. So I'm gonna switch gears just a little bit, and we are going to talk about about the training aspect, the training side of things. I know Paul's gone through and talked a lot about the technique, but of course that's just one side of the story. You can do all the technique sessions you like, but in the end of the day, we still have to get the right training done for triathlon. And this is just a little bit of an example to start, trying just to bring it into the context of basically, where does swimming lie as a percentage of swim, bike, and run? And I just pulled up 3 different examples in from TrainingPeaks. So this is on the left-hand side over here. You can see this is actually some of my data that was actually from 2018 in the build-up to Kona. And you can see that I would typically always have quite a high swim volume. So I would be swimming 5 times a week. It took up 30% of my time, 50% cycling, 20% running. In comparison, last year, this is Fabian Newsome. He's one of the pros that I coach. He is an excellent swimmer, like 157 per 200. So he's like, he did a set the other day where he did 2100s leaving on a 110 turnaround. So he is very good at swimming. So we don't really need to focus too much on his swimming. But last year, we were really trying to get his cycling up. So you can see we got a bit of a shift. close to 60% of his time is spent on the bike, but he was still swimming around 4 to 5 times a week. So he's still getting a lot of frequency in there, but he's obviously training a lot. So much more than your average kind of age group triathlete. And then this is another example, which I typically see as more standardized. It's more, most is a very standard age group athlete. We're typically seeing around 20% of the time swimming, 25% running, and then we've got 49% with like 5% obviously doing other things in terms of strength and mobility and things like that. So what's important to recognize here is that the amount of swimming you're doing is very dependent on what your goals are and also how comfortable you are with swimming and how much it exhausts you and how much you enjoy it. And I personally think that swimming is a great way to increase aerobic fitness generally with minimizing injury risk, which is also really important. So if you're trying to up your volume, you're trying to up it on the run, it can be quite dodgy. But if you just try and up that volume with a little bit more swimming or even cycling, I think it's a much safer way to do things. So yeah, and when it comes to swimming, basically what we're really thinking about within the context of triathlon is that most swim coaches and most triathlon coaches are dealing with 5 different swim sessions a week. And what in Endure IQ, I like to call these training types. So we have these across running as well. We have similar training types across cycling, but with swimming, there's basically 5 different training types. You have your threshold swimming. So Paul's already talked a lot about critical swim speed. You have your endurance swimming, so the kind of those longer swims, longer reps, lower intensity. Have your speed, so things that are quite fast, more recovery, short reps. Obviously technique, so those sessions that are very geared towards homing the specifics around technique. So that will include a lot of specific drills. And then also some sort of recovery. I think, there is actually some great published research that shows that often triathletes who swim in between exercise can perform better in the subsequent exercise. So it can be a really great modality of exercise. And particularly with the pros that I coach, and when I was doing a lot of triathlon, I would never ever have a full rest day. My rest day was a day when I was only swimming because I felt that I would get better recovery from just swimming than doing nothing. And I think that's quite important. And this is just an example at the top here of from TrainingPeaks. You can see these are all sessions that I pulled in that are actually compatible with the Swim Smooth Guru. They're from the Guru. So you can see we've got a threshold session, an endurance session here, which is a bit longer, more of a speed session, a technique session, and a recovery session. And these are all linked back to the Guru with the specific instructions and the paces all the way down the side here. So if you look on the right hand side, the Mega Locks, which is the Goldilocks session, which Paul mentioned earlier. Everything's very specific. We have very unique things around every single session with the timing and exactly what to do within those sessions. But when it comes to it, we're really looking at different amounts of swims that we're doing a week. And typically, I think every single triathlete out there needs to be swimming a minimum of 3 swims per week. I think that's pretty critical. Swimming is one of these things that's very, compared to cycling and running, the detraining effect is much quicker. And the reason being is because with cycling and running, you're typically activating those muscles in some capacity just by walking around, just by doing your day-to-day, walking up steps. Whereas with swimming, if you don't swim, you'll probably do nothing that's going to replicate those specific movements, and you lose the feel for the water. So consistency is really important in swimming. So minimum of 3 sessions per week. And if you are one of those athletes who are doing 3 sessions a week, the 3 you need to focus on: threshold sessions, endurance sessions, and a technique session. And then what you might be doing as you get closer into the season is that you're then switching that technique session either for another endurance session or another speed session. And I think that choice comes from whether you're a diesel or a petrol engine. If you're more of a diesel, you're going to be going more for kind of more of an more of a speed session. If you're the opposite, if you're more of a petrol engine, you might want to put in another endurance type session. So obviously there are individualities within which session you're going to flip it around to, but those would be the ones that you want to keep in there. Conversely, 4 swims a week, I think it can stay quite consistent throughout the year. Your threshold, you've got your endurance, you've got your technique, you've got your speed. You might consider flipping around that endurance for the technique for a double endurance or even a double threshold if you can tolerate it. Obviously, it is a bit more demanding, but that's the 4. And then with the 5 swims per week, typically I would always swim 5 times a week. Most of my pros would swim 5 times a week. Lots of my age groupers even swim 5 times a week because I like to get quite heavy in the swimming. But that's a threshold session, an endurance session, a technique session that would potentially flip into another endurance session, a speed session, and then some sort of recovery session. And the recovery session can just be quite short, 2,000 choice. But when I believe that for a lot of really top age group athletes who are from a non-swimming background, we need to be trying to get between 15 and 20K a week of swimming, which is kind of, I believe, is the price of entry for top age group level swimming. But most athletes, aiming for 10 to 15Ks of swimming a week, I think is quite a good aim in terms of overall total volume. So many people may hear of training intensity distribution. Many will hear of the polarized model of training. So we got the 80% at a low intensity, 20% at a high intensity. With swimming, I always like to think of training intensity distribution. You've got to separate it from your overall week. So I will always typically look at cycling, running on its own, and then I'd also look at almost swimming on its own in isolation. And I think this is a much better method of doing things. But typically when we're doing 4 to 5 times a week, we're not 4 to 5 swims per week. We're not really within a polarized model. It's definitely getting towards what we call the pyramidal model, which is kind of defined as the exact percentages aren't defined, but the pyramidal model generally includes around 25% to 5% of TID at threshold and high intensity training levels, respectively. So you can see that it's a little bit less in that kind of aerobic zone, a little bit more, still majority, of course, a little bit more in the threshold. And then we obviously, because we're including that speed aspect, we are including that anaerobic capacity aspect as well. And then if we're looking at just 3 models, we are losing a bit of that speed, and it's kind of coming up a little bit in terms of that threshold training pace. So if you think about this, how it compares to cycling and running, for example, it's quite easy to get polarized in cycling because we're doing a massive amount of volume in it. So 50%, if we think 50% of our total volume in the week is going to be cycling, of course, we're going to see a lot of level 2 endurance work. Running, on the other hand, it's quite hard for us to go in. If we're just doing 3 runs a week, or we're doing, we're doing 20 to 30%. If we're doing a lot of threshold work, the injury risk is high. Swimming is quite different. So swimming it's non-weight bearing. It's much safer. Apart from the autonomic nervous system disturbances of the high intensity, injury side is quite safe. So you can generally, if you're just doing 3 swims a week, I would always go for a bit more quality because simply you can. So yeah, the threshold model, large volumes of mid-zone work, threshold work is thought to be optimal. Around 57% low intensity, 43% threshold intensity. But what's quite important, what we typically see in triathlon swimming is that the TID in swimming is quite consistent through the year compared to cycling and running, whereas typically, particularly for long distance triathlon, what we really tend to see is we start more polarized in cycling and running, and then we shift more into that pyramidal model where we're doing a little bit more time between the first and the second threshold. And the reason being is because that's where 70.3 Ironman, for example, would lie. That's your race pace intensity. So we typically see as we get more into the season, of course, it's going to be a bit more, and we're going to see a little bit more of that switch towards the pyramidal model. But in swimming, doesn't change as frequently, which is why I like to look at it almost in isolation to the cycling and running. But the question is then how do we go around building the right session? And of course, it's quite simple. Building the right session is about intensity, specificity. And, when it comes to training, we are very demand driven. And that means that we respond to the intensity that is imposed upon it. And that is something called the SAID principle. So a specific adaptation of imposed demand. So if you want to improve your thresholds, you want to do threshold training. If you want to do endurance training, it's got to be long. It's got to be at a lower intensity. Of course, there is crossover. Of course, there is. But these are the sorts of, this kind of guidance is really quite helpful for when we're starting to think about building these training sessions. And the SAID principle is something that's really, really important. And it transcends into not only all different, lots of aspects of triathlon, but I mean, I work in a lot of different sports. And it's always the one that I'll always come back to is a specific adaptation of imposed demands because it's one that will always hold true in nearly every single circumstance. But just to go back to Alistair and Johnny, so I actually worked with these when I was doing my masters. I was at Leeds Met University. I had a scholarship there. Alistair and Johnny were there, but I just wanted to read from the same book because where they talked about technique, they also talked about the training side of things. And I'll just read it straight up. So it said the most important technical thing about triathlon swimming is the ratio between your threshold speed and your maximum speed. There are three different types of swimmers in triathlon. Those that have a relatively high maximum speed to a lower threshold speed, those with a relatively low maximum speed to a higher threshold, and those that have a relatively low maximum and a low threshold speed. Triathletes from the first and last groups often perform remarkably similar in races, even though on paper, those from the first are much better swimmers. You'll see some swimmers who are very fast in the pool but haven't developed their ability to swim effectively at pace over long distances. They've trained at a really high pace all the time. They'll go out hard and use up all their strength too fast, which is why there is generally a dead spot in races at about 300 to 400 meters. Because Johnny and I don't have loads of power, we can't go really fast, and so we can't go into the red. And as it turns out, completely by fluke, this makes us ideal for triathlon swimming. I'm not sure we would get much faster even if we swam at the exclusion of everything else. We don't have big enough shoulders and we're not 6'5". There's a biological cap on it. And I think that is, in essence, what we are thinking about when we are developing our swimming. And Paul talked about the differences between Reese and Lucy and the diesel engine versus the petrol. And Alistair and Johnny gave the exact same example there, the three different swimmers. So what Alistair and Johnny were saying is that C and A in an actual race will, in a 1500 meter or a long distance race or a triathlon, will actually perform the same, even though on paper, A is a much faster swimmer because look at his maximal sprinting speed. But really, because their thresholds are the same, doesn't really make that much difference. And in exercise physiology, we call this the anaerobic speed reserve. And the anaerobic speed reserve is important for some things like a sprint finish. But unfortunately, in a triathlon, when you don't really need to do a sprint finish unless you're going for a swim preem, it's not really going to have much effect on the overall outcome of your race. And again, this is the same. This is another example of two swimmers who have the drop off, and it's the exact same as Lucy and Reese showed, is that really what we're striving towards is we're looking towards the swimmer in the red because that will end up inevitably with better race outcomes. And when it comes down to it, it's all about high intensity interval training and the manipulation and how we manipulate sessions or training sessions to make them shifting them more towards the aerobic side. And I would encourage you all, if you're interested in high-intensity interval training, do have a read of a book called by Marnie Bichette and Dr. Paul Lawson, which is the High-Intensity Interval Training Puzzle. I wrote 2 chapters in that book on rowing and triathlon. And in that book, it talks about 3 different areas of high-intensity interval training. So you've got your aerobic component, your anaerobic component, and your neuromuscular component. And the way you manipulate sessions... and the way you manipulate sessions will affect the outcome of that session. I'm going to discuss that in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. So what Paul already talked about, this is a very, very typical swim session that I would see lots of my athletes doing who are going to masters swim sessions. So they go to a masters swim session, we often see this as a set. So this is just an example of someone who, imagine they've got a 120 critical swim speed, for example, and the session they'll often do is like 10 times 100 on a 145 turnaround, so they're getting quite a lot of rest, and 2100s, and absolutely smoking them, swimming them in like 110 to 115, and as a result, they think they're swimming really well. But inevitably, this does not transcend into a good performance. And what we need to do is we need to think about the way that we manipulate training sessions in order to change these three components. And just from the high intensity interval training side of things, if we increase the intensity of the rep, for example, we're making it more anaerobic, we're making it more neuromuscular. So we're taking away from the aerobic side. If we decrease the duration of the rep, sorry, if we increase the duration of the rep, it's going to be sending it more to the aerobic side. And if we increase the recovery between reps, it's shifting it towards the anaerobic and the neuromuscular side. On the other side, if we decrease the recovery between reps, of course, that's making it towards more the aerobic side, which is probably where we're wanting to shift the training for in the context of triathlon. And if we decrease the intensity of the rep, it's going to be doing the same. Good thing is, if you decrease the recovery and you increase the duration of the rep, you're actually going to be by default reducing the recovery between. You're going to be changing it towards the mainly aerobic side anyway. And then lastly, if you decrease the duration of the rep, making it shorter, generally shifts it more towards the anaerobic side. Of course, there's different manipulations that you can do. You can decrease the duration of the rep and decrease the recovery of the rep, which makes it more towards the aerobic side as well. But these are kind of the rules that we have to apply when we're manipulating high intensity interval training or we're manipulating any type of swim set or swimming session. So this is this is that same session. Again, it's 3,000 meters and we're just making it more specific to the triathlete. So the same warm up, but all we've done is we've made it 10 200s and we've been very specific on the pace now. So it's at CSS plus 0. So it's at our CSS pace. So he has to swim at 120s. We can do that with the form goggles. We could do that by setting the beeper. We could do that any way you want. But we're also going to be setting the recovery. So with this, we have something called the red mist cycles. So the RM3 would mean that if you swing 40 seconds per 50, we're adding on 3 seconds, which would be 126 per 100, which means we're leaving on a 252 turnaround for the 200. So again, we're being very specific for the recovery. And this can then go into any swimmer. So any swimmer who knows the CSS, and we say RM3, we have very specific recovery for the individual. So it's going away from generic recovery when you have two swimmers who are swimming the same 10 200s and you're saying, oh, we're just going to leave on 3 minutes and one of them swimming in 230s, the other one swimming in 255s. It's a very different session, right? Very, very different because we just talked about how the recovery affects the output of the session. So this makes it much more specific. So just going into endurance swims would be another session. Very typical endurance swim, I'd see something like this. This is a 4,300 meter set. So something like 2100s on 50, 10 100s on 130, and then 20 times 50 on 50 again. Quite short reps. We can definitely make this a little bit more specific towards triathlon. So to make it more specific, what could we do? It's actually the very same distance in the main set, but we're just increasing the duration. We're being very specific around the pacing. So CSS plus 3, so 3 seconds slower than what the critical swim speed is. So for this swimmer, it would be swimming in 120s. And then we're just taking 1 beat recovery. So that means that if they're swimming in 23 seconds, they're going to get 23. If it's 23 seconds per 25 in the 25-meter pool, they're going to get 23 seconds recovery. And then we're going to increase the pace. We're going to do 5 200, so longer reps, plus 2 seconds on the CSS, and then finally 10 100s plus 1, all with 1 beat recovery. Very specific and very individualized to the swimmer. And you can see how now we're just going to get so much more bang for a buck with almost the exact same time spent in the pool, in fact. In fact, this session might be even less time spent in the pool, but we're just going to be getting a lot more out of it. So I guess I'm gonna have to pass this back to Paul. Maybe
you can bring
yeah,
them up
just
there.
read it. Yeah. So we got some take-home points, and some from Paul, then some from me.
Great. Yeah. So obviously, as I covered there, I want to really get specific with the technique advice you actually follow. So reading about stuff like lengthening out your stroke, reducing stroke rate, and making sure your stroke count in the pool is as low as possible is not necessarily going to help you with your triathlon swimming. We need to make sure we're getting really specific with that, and obviously you can track that within the guru. Obviously, as Dan's mentioned there, and Dan, I have to say that was a really good presentation, mate. Really well understood in terms of how to get very specific with the type of training sessions that you do. In fact, the last example you used was very, very similar to the session that we just did on the pool deck just yesterday morning. We call them red mist endurance sessions. They're the hardest sessions of the week. But this specificity, especially in terms of rest recovery ratio, is super important. A lot of times people, I hear some negative feedback from people saying, oh, that Paul Newsome, he just uses that tempo trainer all the bloody time. Why do you have to rely upon the tempo trainer? Why can't you use the clock? In fact, we had that just on an Instagram thing the other day, and it was from a pure swimmer. The pure swimmer says, you triathletes, you just need to learn how to use the clock. But that's missing the point entirely. The point is with the clock, you end up rounding out your recovery cycle. So Dan gave a great example there of two swimmers doing the same set, but one of them's only getting 5 seconds rest. The other one's getting 35 seconds rest or whatever it was. Basically, those are two very, very different sessions. By utilizing the tempo trainer and giving you very specific advice on your pace and your recovery as well, we can standardize it across the board for every swimmer. Next one there, Dan. So you can obviously record and analyze your swims with the power of the stroke insights. Those are the funky things that we're doing with the accelerometer and gyro within the watch. I should point out as well, because I don't think I mentioned it earlier on, but this will also work in the open water for you. Okay, so take your Garmin, take your Apple Watch out there, use the Swim Smooth Guru app on those watches or those devices, and we'll also be able to give you that stroke insight. And some of you might be quite surprised to see technically you might be swimming better in the open water. So potentially, like Lucy said right at the start, she said she didn't really think about adapting a stroke to the open water. It just sort of came to her. Now, obviously, I've done quite a bit of coaching video analysis with her, and my best man at my wedding was actually Lucy's coach when she was a kid training in the UK as a pure pool swimmer. And his remark to me, we did a podcast, all three of us together with Reese on there as well. And he just remarked that, she always had this slightly different style of stroke. And he was always encouraging her to try to go into open water because he knew how good that would be. His name's Roy Shepherdson, if you're interested. Good bloke. So yeah, obviously need to make sure we're following that actionable advice to ensure you're improving week in, week out. And the tempo trainer specifically is very, very useful for that because you can just make those sort of adjustments week in, week out as you're going along. 1/100th of a second improvement, or maybe a 10th of a second improvement. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it definitely stacks up over the time. And those marginal gains, if you want to call it that, can really, really stack up. And last one there, Dan. Now, this bit of tongue in cheek here, but I produced a video, another YouTube video last year. It wasn't actually very well watched, but I was a bit disappointed about it because it was a review of the 4 female Ironman world champions that I've actually been privileged to work with in the past. So Chelsea Sodaro, Lucy Charles-Barkley, Leander Cave, and also Anna Haug as well. And it's an example from each one of their video analysis sessions, the advice that I was giving to them to help them improve their swimming. And really the take-home point from that video, in actual fact, I start off right at the beginning just saying, don't let anyone tell you you've got a messy stroke. After all, no one tells that to Lucy Charles-Barkley or Alistair Brownlee either. So your stroke as a triathlete or as an open water swimmer might not look particularly pretty in the pool, and mine doesn't, and I'm still racing at a good level in the open water. I still do the occasional triathlon, but mainly open water. It doesn't have to be pretty to be effective. And that's really my key take-home point there. Thanks, Dan.
Cool, thank you. I have to say my swimming doesn't look that pretty either, and I'm not that fast, so. Yeah, so just on the training side, the percentage of time spent swimming should be within the context of bike and run, but 20 to 30% is pretty standard. Where that lies for the context of you, think about your overall goals, think about what you're trying to achieve, think about how much you like swimming as well. Also, threshold endurance and technique are the cornerstones of the swimming triangle. So, if you're doing most triathletes are doing 3 swims a week, try and get these ones in. Really focus on the technique and make sure that is done properly. With and if you can get feedback from things like the Swim Guru, I think it's all the better. And always remember the SAID principle, so a specific adaptation of imposed demands. Manipulate your swimming sessions to build endurance, threshold, and also threshold durability. So also my research that I do at my university, AUT University, we focus on this concept of durability. So it's the ability to not only have a higher threshold, but also sustain a threshold for a long period of time. And that's also important. And you do that through doing the longer sets, longer reps and longer sets. And be specific around basing swimming on CSS speed if you can, and manipulate your intervals to drive intensity. So what I already talked about is that the cool thing is that you can manipulate intervals to drive intensity. If I said to someone, okay, now we're gonna do 10 100s on a 2 minutes, or we're gonna do 5 200s, and we're gonna do them on like a 125, it totally changes the session for 120 swimmer, for example, because you will automatically do it at the right pace. And you can, if you can't use the beeper, you can't use the clock, these are ways that you can manipulate sessions to automatically get the right outcome that you are looking for. And then finally, with swimming, consistency is key. I've already talked about why that is compared to cycling and running, but get in the water 3 times a week as a minimum, and enjoy your swimming. So lastly, if you do want to check out the squad, do so. We're offering 50% off for the first 3 months at the moment. So if you go check out the squad via the link, and I'm sure it'll be provided by TrainingPeaks. Squad 50 will be the code, and you'll get access, free TrainingPeaks account, free access to the guru, and all the insights that Paul provided as well. And of course, you get to connect with all the Endure IQ coaches and great training programs in building up to your next race. And with that said, I think we were way over time, but we hopefully might have some people there for some questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan and Paul. Just wanted to jump into the question and answer here. Um, I'm just gonna start at the bottom because this is a quick one. How often should the CSS test be repeated?
That's a great question to start off with there, Josh. Reason being, when I happen to have it right here, look, the Swim Smooth book. This was published in 2012, and in all the stuff that we publicized really way back from 2007. Initially, the recommendation would have been to do the CSS test every maybe 4 to 6 weeks. But the problem with that is that you might have actually made some improvement between those 4 to 6 weeks, and then by the time you actually retest, you might have actually still been doing your training sessions diligently at your old CSS pace from 6 weeks ago, but essentially detraining. So like Dan says, the intensity there is really, really important. So what we do these days is we start you off with a CSS test right at the start of the program, and then we have a cool little thing built within the Swim Smooth Guru called the CSS Tweaker. So you can actually go in there, and it's on the home progress page, front and central for every time you swim. Basically, if you do a set, so let's say you've done 10 times 200 meters at CSS pace with 30 seconds rest between each one, or on an RM cycle of 5 or something like that, and you come home and you thought, you know what, I nailed every single one of those intervals and I feel like I could push it a bit further next week, you'd go into the CSS Tweaker and you tell it that you've had a good day, and it'll actually just do the calculation for you. So that's what we'd be recommending now these days, is do a CSS test so you know where you're starting at, and then as you progress going forwards, just use the little CSS Tweaker almost on like a sort of a response basis as we go. The point that Dan just raised as well about intensity earlier on, just last week, my wife's going to hate me for saying this, but ironically enough, I'd spent 10 hours writing that blog last week on swimming by numbers. And she goes, Paul, can we just have a session where you don't use a tempo trainer? And I said, what do you mean? She says, those technique endurance sessions. So these technique endurance sessions that we do on a Tuesday, they're a bit of technique work and then a bit of endurance work. And usually on the endurance work, I'll have the tempo trainer on. And she's like, I get so stressed using the tempo trainer. I said, why? On those particular sessions, I'm actually getting to swim 6 seconds, usually 6 seconds per 100 meters slower, to really tap into that lower aerobic system. And the beeper's there to actually just make sure you don't go too fast. So there should be no stress using it at all. In many ways, if you think you're doing endurance, but you actually tip over into threshold, then the effectiveness of that session is going to be gone completely. So the tempo trainer, I stand by it. It really is just a great way to actually control that.
One thing I will add is that when you use the tempo, the CSS tweaker, you would have to then tweak it also in TrainingPeaks. So that change in the guru, you just have to make the same change in TrainingPeaks to make sure it's all going. But the tweaker is a great tool.
Looks like we've got a few questions here related to pool versus open water. Um, so, like, how do you structure your training sessions for open water rather than the pool, or what's the frequency, volume, intensity? Like how, if you're only doing 3 swims a week, how many of those need to be open water? How do you find that balance?
I think.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Dan. Do you want to take it?
For me to go, well, I'll go first, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think the answers to this question can often be seasonal as well. Like many people cannot swim in open water all year round, so you have that taken care of for yourself. But I think during the summer, during the racing season, I think like you could switch that endurance session for a open water session. It's quite hard to do technique sessions in the pool. It's actually quite hard to do threshold sessions technique sessions in open water. It's quite hard to do threshold sessions in open water, but for doing those long swims, it's quite effective. And now you can almost just like you can either do one or two things. You can use something like your Garmin to do it on distance, or you can just transfer that into time and do the whole thing on time. So if you know you're going to be swimming like 200s and you want to be swimming at threshold pace, you can just switch it to 240, 2 minutes and 40-second reps. But I think like doing it once a week as you build up to a race, you might like start in the season, you might start with endurance in the pool, and then gradually as you get towards racing, you would do it more in the open water because it's like I said, the principle of training, principle of specificity is always the key, and we need to be demand driven. So the closer we get to racing, the closer our sessions need to be to the racing environment and the racing intensity. So that's the way I would think about it.
Absolutely, yeah. Within the Swim Smooth Guru, we've got a thing called pace execution score, which works really, really well, obviously, in the pool. So we can say that you paced yourself out really well here. We'll give you a score of 92 out of 100, for example. So we actually look at the individual lap intervals. The problem with in the open water, we did have that initially within the Guru, and then we found out and obviously logically realized that in the open water you could have swell, you could have chop, you could have current that you're working against. So some of those numbers become a little bit irrelevant then at that point in time. But if you've done all your training in the pool using the tempo trainer, pacing yourself out properly, you'll know what those intensities actually feel like, and then you're trying to do that, like Dan says, using the Garmin in the open water. Within the on the Swim Smooth Guru app on the Garmin, we've actually got it defaulted to actually beeping at you every 100 meters. So a quick glance down at the watch, you can see what pace you've done, or just keep a track of the distance that you've done, and work with it like that. I made a major mistake. One of mine and Dan's training buddies back in the UK, a guy called Andy Blow, we for a 6 month, no, sorry, it was maybe more like a 3 or 4 month period. Me and Andy went and did a long training camp prior to the British Triathlon Championships. And we decided that given the lack of swimming pools in the area, we'd be super specific and we'd just swim every single day in the open water. But we had no idea of what speed or intensity we were swimming at. We just thought, okay, we're just swimming hard. And when it came to the championships, because we'd spent so much time in the open water, like really thinking we're getting very specific, we'd lost a lot of that high end aerobic capability from missing out on the pool session. So you can sometimes you can think you're being specific by being in the open water, but if you're just going for long swims and you've got no idea of your intensity and you're not doing anything structured, then that might actually work against you as well. So I think that's an important consideration as well.
Great. We've got a couple of like beginner questions, if you will. This one's kind of complex, so I'll read it. We've got a beginner swimmer requires, say, 38 strokes to get across a single length of a 20-meter pool. Would you recommend that they first improve their technique to be more efficient, or uh, or work the foundational skills at a lower stroke rate and then learn to turn it over a bit more?
It's a good question. Obviously, we touched a little bit on stroke counts and those sort of things. I think where people have fallen foul in the past is there used to be this holy panacea that unless you could swim less than 20 strokes per 25 meters, you weren't being efficient at all. And yet, I can count on many hands many elite swimmers that I've worked with and triathletes who can't do that. They're taking in excess of 25 strokes per 25 meters, and many people in the past would have considered that inefficient. Now, without actually having seen that swimmer, you mentioned 38 38 strokes per 25, then obviously that is a lot of strokes per 25. Potentially, you know, if you were to swim with the guru on, we'd be able to pick up whether or not other issues are there within the stroke. So you might expect to see somebody crossing over quite a bit at that sort of speed. The implication would be that the legs would be creating a huge amount of drag. That would mean that they weren't then covering a lot of distance per stroke, or maybe they're pulling through with dead straight arms and not actually pressing water back. Somebody like Michael Phelps, who covers a lot of distance on each stroke, 22 or 23 strokes per 50 meters. When you actually look at it, firstly, he's only swimming for 35 meters out of that 50. He normally has to dive and push off to 15 meters. But what you actually see with those guys is they don't actually increase the length of the stroke by gliding more. They're actually spending longer time pressing water back behind. And that's something to really, really bear in mind, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, is it's not just about the stroke count. It's a balance between the length of the stroke and the rating of the stroke there as well. So I'd encourage whoever's asked that question. It's a great question, don't get me wrong, and technically chances are that if you're doing 38 strokes per 25 and maybe you're swimming 2 minutes 20 per 100 meters or 2 minutes 30 per 100 meters or something like that, then chances are drag is a big factor. And I'd encourage you to go and watch our YouTube video specifically on that. It's got a lot of hits. We talk about a guy who knocked off 42 seconds per 100 meters just by working on all the classic things to help to get his bum and legs up in the water. Even then, though, I wasn't focused at all on the number of strokes he could take per length, because that as a metric by itself is just not it's just not a sign of efficiency. You know, a lot of these watches will actually record and measure a thing called SWOLF, but the first video in that sequence really debunks that myth about whether or not that's a true measure of efficiency there. So have a little look at those videos. Dial into number 2. I would imagine that the drag profile in the water is quite the problem, not so much the number of strokes, as it were.
Kind of to follow up on that, like how do you prevent burnout and overtraining in triathletes who are novices in swimming but excel in biking and running?
Dan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why. I guess, you know, I guess that question is coming from an aspect where they're finding swimming quite exhausting. So, you know, and everything's at a high intensity. So I think, you know, I had this question in we have a weekly Endure IQ webinar with a squad, and I had a question that was very similar, who said they were finding swimming very exhausting. And I think one of the main things that, if you remember in Paul's hierarchy, the very bottom of it was breathing. And the reason the very bottom of it's breathing is because if you don't have that sorted, you will find swimming very hard and very exhausting, because you haven't got your breathing, rhythm and timing correct. So I think the first thing I'll be looking at for the person who's asking that question would be specifics around technique and specifics around the breathing. I know the like Swim Smooth are big on the bubble breathe technique, where you're practicing exhaling underwater to kind of improve that efficiency. So I'd definitely be looking at that. But you know, the only way to prevent burnout and look at it is that we live in a very objective world where we can measure a lot of things. We talked about the insights of swim smooth techniques. I'll be looking at your heart variability and your resting heart rate and keeping track of that on top of everything else to make sure you're not burning out. And you know, and if you're, you know, there's 3 pillars of recovery. There's your training periodization. These are the main things that you need to think about: is your training periodization, your sleep, and then your nutrition. And just to sit on the training periodization side, it becomes very specific to a swimmer who finds swimming very exhausting. So even if you're doing an endurance session and you're thinking, oh, well, this is an endurance session, I can do a high intensity bike or run session shortly after, it might not be that easy for you, and your overall stress might be very high. So I would be considering what you're doing after those sessions, and you might want to have a bigger gap or recovery between when you're going to do your next high intensity bike or run session, regardless of whether that's swimming's a threshold session or an endurance session, because the endurance session might be a little bit more physiologically demanding for you anyway.
I'd add to that and just say that first and foremost, we've talked a lot about threshold, both of us today. If a number of times I ask people and they say, "Oh, I find swimming really really challenging, really exhausting. I'm swimming 3 times a week." So this is not your beginner swimmer. This is somebody who's actually been swimming for a reasonable amount of time, but they're still finding swimming quite exhausting. And I'll say, "What is your threshold pace?" And they can't give me a straight answer. They don't know what it is. So chances are, in some of the sessions that they're doing, they think they're actually developing their aerobic system, but in fact, they're just continuing to swim a bit too quick. They're probably quite an anaerobic animal as we see it, and just swimming, and the intensity is just too high. And as I mentioned earlier on, using the tempo trainer to actually slow you down is really super important. But you'll only know what that intensity needs to be if you've done that test in the first place. Now, I'll just add one extra point to this, and when somebody swims with a pool buoy, so a lot of people get exhausted when they're swimming. They classically reach out and grab a pool buoy, and they think, okay, well, this is good because it's allowing me to finish the set, or this is good because it's representing the use of my wetsuit. Really, what that pool buoy is doing, it's doing two things. It's increasing your buoyancy, so lifting your bum and legs high. So if you are a low sinky, draggy swimmer, then it's going to feel a lot easier. You're probably operating at 25, 30 beats per minute on the heart rate, lower at the same given swimming speed. But what it's also doing, I keep mentioning drag, it's also likely to be bringing the legs together. So even though you might be crossing over and the legs might be naturally kicking apart, with the pool buoy in, it's keeping those legs close together. So yes, the pool buoy will keep the intensity down a little bit and allow you to swim those longer distances, but you need to be very, very careful about that becoming just like a crux that you always reach out for, because you won't progress from that point. And the idea of it being specific to a wetsuit is a bit ill-founded. I would much prefer somebody to be wearing buoyancy shorts. Hoob wetsuits, for example, do a great range of buoyancy shorts there, some of which we've actually personally designed. They call them a kick pant. And the whole idea is that it's giving you the buoyancy, it's giving you that little bit of relief to allow you to actually enjoy your swimming. Dan keeps touching on this importance of enjoyment and fun when you're swimming. It's so important. So if you hate your swimming, as a lot of triathletes tend to do, but you can utilize something like a buoyancy short, which is going to give you a little bit of lift, make it feel a little bit easier without it actually negatively just hiding and masking all the issues with your stroke. A lot of the girls in our squad refer to them as cheaty pants, but if it makes you enjoy your swimming a little bit more and allows you to be a little bit more aerobic, then don't be afraid to use those, especially if most of your races are going to be in a wetsuit as well.
All right, just a couple more because we're getting long here. Let's see. What are your opinions on the use of form goggles and the real-time feedback in this, what is this? And the 6 specific post-swim results?
Okay, well, firstly, the stroke insights won't work with the form goggles. It's using an algorithm that's actually mixed and matched with the Garmin or Apple device. I know, Dan, you use the form goggles quite a lot. I actually visited. I went over to Form. They invited me over in Vancouver back in December 2022. I think the system that they've got there is fantastic. The analytics that they produce, the app that they produce, is really very, very good indeed. And the accuracy of the data is also really good. One of the reasons they're able to get so accurate with that data is because the gyros and accelerometers actually sit within the goggle. So when you finish and stand up, it's very, very easy for the hardware to detect that you've finished an interval. And in my testing, we've seen that they can actually detect a stoppage time of around about 4 seconds. So if you are doing some of these longer intervals with short reps and recovery cycles, the form goggles are actually very good at actually defining that and actually showing you when you've stopped and measuring the rest and recovery. Apple Watch's Garmin devices on the auto rest feature. So if you're not using the buttons to stop and start, you'll need around about 10 seconds gap. So sometimes a set of 2050s on an RM cycle of 4, for example, will actually just present as 1,000 meters rather than 2050s. And that's nothing to do with what we're doing wrong within the algorithm. It's just simply that the accelerometers and gyros don't know that you finished swimming at that point in time. the in terms of the getting that feedback on the display, it's really good to actually have it there. Personally, I found it gives me a little bit of tunnel vision, so some of my peripheral awareness when I'm swimming can be affected by that. And yeah, but I think they're definitely a great concept, and I look forward to the development and evolution of the goggles over the coming years. Dan, do you want to add to that? Because I know you use them in every swim that you do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love the form goals. I think they're amazing. I mean, when I was training and they were available, I used them. I used them pretty much every swim. You know, to the point where if they weren't charged, I'd be not almost not doing the swim, waiting for to do it a bit later because I was that obsessed with the data. But I think like I never used any of the workout function. I never used that, but I did use them for tracking my training load, tracking my progression, and essentially, we talked about pace. We talked about how we can use it for pacing and the tempo trainer to set a pace. You're seeing your splits every turn, right? So if you have a training session that is well designed and very specific towards you, and you have something like you swimming on CSS +4, you can use your form goggles to pace you, right? You can use it to make sure you're on the right pace, and I think that's the most important thing and the biggest use case for them, and certainly in terms of what I was using.
Yeah, I think especially if you're training, remotely by yourself, they're really really good for that. The whole reason I went over to Vancouver in December 2022 was to actually create a hookup, if you like, to actually push the Swim Smooth sessions from the Guru onto the Form goggles. And that hookup has come by way of the Training Peaks
Yeah.
hookup that
So
we've
that's
done with
that
the
that's yeah.
Guru.
Exactly. So that's a good point. Is that like because all of the Swim Smooth Guru sessions we've now brought them into Training Peaks and we put them in the Training Peaks account. They by default are compatible with Form goggles as well. So Swim Smooth the sessions out of the Guru don't go to Swim Smooth, don't go to the Form goggles, but our ones that are within Training Peaks that go to our squad members and our athletes, they're all compatible with Form. So yeah.
Yeah. There's still a little bit of development required on how readable some of those sessions are, because obviously we give quite a bit of detail when they're coming through. But yeah, no, it's a great system, and like I say, I'd love to see how the goals develop over time. And imagine if you could actually get the Swim Smooth Guru insights at the same time as the insights that Form are giving you with regards to your head position, then you've got a very, very good, really, really solid system there to help triathletes around the world improve. So who knows where that might go now that we're fully linked up here with Training Peaks, and could be something to consider and discuss going forwards.
All right. I think that will do it. I want to thank you guys, Paul and Dan, for taking the time out of your days to make this happen.
No worries. It's been a privilege talking to you guys. I feel like it's a bit of a full circle for me, given it's 2007 when I first went down there to Colorado Springs, and big fan of Training Peaks and all that you guys have done over the years. So yeah, it's a real privilege to speak to everyone today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. Yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll find another reason to come on again at some time in the near future, I hope.
And for anybody who's still on, we will be posting this recording to our Training Peaks YouTube account, and we'll send out a follow-up email probably tomorrow with all the links. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.